Hello and welcome to the Culture Connection Speaker Series. I'm Michael Beckelheimer in Washington, D.C. And in this edition of Culture Connection, I'm talking to Americans who combine their passion for culture with their entrepreneurial spirit, how they create their own paths doing what they love, and what can we learn from them. This program is presented by the American Center of Moscow in association with the American Embassy in Moscow. If you're watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post comments and questions at any time. As we get questions, we'll ask them as we have time. Today, we're talking to Charles Hecker, a former journalist and geopolitical risk consultant who spent 40 years working and traveling in Russia. Charles knows Russia and Russian well. He calls himself a Russia geek, and he's one of those lucky people who worked in a place he loved. Now he's written a new book, Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. And we're going to talk about his book and talk about his life. And Chuck, welcome.
Michael, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So glad to see you. We're old friends, and so I'm going to call you Chuck.
Please do.
That's okay. I want to start with you being a Russia geek. We love Russia geeks. You're passionate about Russian culture, society, history. You speak the language fluently. So where, when, and how did this interest begin?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thank you to everybody else who's joining. It is an absolute pleasure to be here, and also thank you very much for plugging the book. It's very kind of you, and it is great to be here with you, Michael. I mean, as you mentioned, we have known each other for a very long time. I think we're both Russia geeks, and so it's good to be speaking in more ways than one a common language. Michael, I mean, the great fortune of my career and the past, 30, 40 or more years was that my vocation and my avocation, sort of, what I did for a living and what I did kind of out of personal interest coincided. And that was, living and working and understanding Russian, working in Russia and in Russian. And it started a very long time ago, as these stories often do. I was a language student, a Russian language student, in my second year of university at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And as often happens when you're a student at university, you have a fantastic professor who captivates you with amazing material and with the delivery and with the subject matter. And all of that happened in my Russian language class, number one. And then number two, my professor was a leading figure in a language program that was hosted by my university and a number of universities, including the University of New Hampshire, in Leningrad at the time, in what was then the Soviet Union. And this consortium of universities, with the cooperation of the Herzen Institute, Institut imени Hertzena in Leningrad, offered summer courses. And so a group of my fellow students and I jumped on a plane. And after a little bit of a plane and a little bit of a train and a little bit of a bus, we wound up taking language classes in 1983 in Leningrad. And at that point, really, Michael, the hook was set. I had started university wanting to study biology. And after my summer in Leningrad, all I really wanted to do was study more Russian and Russian history and Russian literature and more language and get to know the country better and better.
Of course. And then after college, you went on to graduate school. You got a master's degree in Russian.
That's right. So you will know this very well because directly after graduating with a bachelor's degree, I went and enrolled. I was fortunate enough to be accepted to and enrolled in a master's program at what was then called the Russian Research Center at Harvard University. Anybody who's familiar with the center now knows that it's called the Davis Center. And of course, that's where you and I met, Michael, because you have the same degree, but just a few years after me. And you graduated from the Davis Center, right? Or did you graduate from the Russian Research Center?
I started at the Russian Research Center and graduated from the Davis Center.
There you go. So you're familiar with transition periods. And so, getting 2 years of exposure to leading academics and leading scholars and leading students at one of the most important places to study Russia, to study Russian, to study the Soviet Union. Remember, that's what it was still at the time. To do that for 2 years, I mean, it was an awful lot of hard work, but it was a fantastic opportunity. It was, challenging. It was exciting. Also, don't forget that I started my master's degree in 1985, which basically coincided with a very, very interesting period of transition in the Soviet Union. And we got to study perestroika, we got to study glasnost, we got to know somebody called Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. And it was an enormously exciting time to be a student of Russian studies. And it was an extremely exciting place to do it.
So fast forward, we're going to keep moving because we have a lot to cover. Fast forward through your early professional career as a journalist, and you ended up in Moscow working as a journalist in the early 90s.
That's right. As often happens in life, some of the best things happen by coincidence. And at the time, I was a journalist at a newspaper in the United States called the Miami Herald, living and working in Miami, Florida. And a colleague of mine came up to me at one point and said, "You speak Russian, don't you? And you studied all these Russian things, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, well, as a matter of fact, I did." And she said, "I have this friend who works at a newspaper called the Moscow Times. And he's actually leaving. He's changing jobs. And the Moscow Times has a vacancy, and they're looking for a reporter to come live and work in Moscow." And I jumped. I just absolutely jumped at the opportunity. The normal path in American journalism is you start with very, very small newspapers. You work your way up to medium-sized newspapers, then you get to very big newspapers. The Miami Herald at the time was a very big newspaper. And what you tried to do is you tried to get a job with the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, and you try to get a job in their Moscow bureau. That was going to take a lot longer if I stayed in Miami. And so I took the chance immediately to move to the Moscow Times. And in 1994, I applied for the job. I got accepted. And remember, this is a long time before we could do things like Zoom interviews. Mm-hmm. But a few phone calls and a few emails. After that, I was packing my bags and once again was on a plane headed to, this time, Russia. And, I think it was in September, maybe October. It was October, I believe, of 1994 that I started, writing stories and writing articles for the Moscow Times.
That's, and then, of course, this culminates in this book we're going to talk about. But at that time, Americans, by the hundreds, it seems, were flocking to Russia to take advantage and of this new era in openness and business opportunity. You arrived basically at the same time, and you were working at the Moscow Times. So you went over as a journalist. You were furthering your career as a journalist and living in Russia. Were you, at what point did you become interested in the business community and what was happening in business? Were you writing about business as a Moscow Times journalist?
So I was writing about, there was a business desk. There was a business department at the Moscow Times. And I was more a sort of news reporter. But really, the Moscow Times is, as everyone I'm sure knows, was a very small, was at the time a very small organization. And everybody did a little bit of everything. And we all pitched in and we wrote about whatever was happening at the time. And you're absolutely right, Michael, to point out that Americans and people from all over the world were coming to Russia. When I got there, the Russian Federation was just 2 years old. And people were coming from all over the world for business opportunities, for cultural opportunities, for professional opportunities, in diplomacy and in, just about every walk and facet of life. And the Moscow Times, we were writing about all of it. There was a shift in my own professional direction while I was at the Moscow Times, because what happened to me, Michael, is that in addition to writing about what was happening as a journalist, I found myself wanting increasingly really to participate in what was happening. And, I had the Russian language and the Russian studies background, and I thought that might be useful in lots of different contexts beyond journalism. And so the real career transformation for me, Michael, was, yes, in part writing about the business opportunities that were emerging in the 1990s in Russia, but it came as a desire to want to be a participant rather than an observer in what was happening on the ground.
So let's see, you were last in Russia in 1983, right? To study the language. Had you been back before 94?
That's right. So the first trip was in 1983 as a language student. And then, I went on vacation. And I went on vacation to the Soviet Union in 1991. And it was at the very beginning of 1991. It was the winter of 1991. And I believe it was around February of 1991. And I went for, I think it was about 10 days. And it was, as anybody with an eye towards history and anyone who's joined the conversation that is perhaps a little bit closer to us in age than further, 1991 was an interesting time to be in the Soviet capital. I, again, had phenomenal freedom as somebody who spoke the language and could do what I want. And I took advantage of all of the cultural opportunities that Moscow made available, even though it was a bit cold walking around the center of town in February. But I went to all the museums, and I went to the theater, and I went to the Bolshoi, and I went to the conservatory. And I did a bit of shopping, and I did a bit of souvenir hunting. But mostly what I was there was to sort of just take in the atmosphere of, first of all, having been in 1983, there was a huge change from 83 to 91. And also it was the first time I had to spend an awful lot of time on the ground in Moscow because the language courses were in Leningrad. And so I took advantage of being in the capital and familiarizing myself with that city and, enjoying the contrast between Leningrad and Moscow, or what is now St. Petersburg and Moscow, because as everyone will know, those are two those are two dramatically different cities with very different atmospheres. And I loved being in the capital, and I loved being in the big city, and I loved all the sort of the noise and the traffic and the fuss of being in Moscow in the early 90s.
Did you go to McDonald's while you were there?
That's a very good question. Did I? I must have. I'm sure I have been to McDonald's in Russia on more than one occasion. And I think strictly for cultural purposes.
Sure.
Yes, I did. I must have done, because how could you be in Moscow in 1991 and not have a Big Mac and fries? And I think I probably had a vanilla shake, because that was my beverage of choice in McDonald's, no matter where I was. And so, yes, I queued up, I got in, placed my orders, and had sort of the ultimate cultural experience of a Big Mac, smack in the center of the Russian capital.
See, I ask you that question because I was living in Moscow at the exact same time, February of 1991, and I was with other American students, and there was a big divide. Those of us who went to McDonald's and those of us who didn't, because they thought that it was a terrible, terrible, cultural indictment to, actually step foot into McDonald's. But it was such an interesting part of what was happening in Moscow at the time. But the main reason was there were food deficits at that time. The stores were empty. The bread stores were empty. It was difficult getting into restaurants. So I actually went there to eat. Then I met some wonderful Russian friends there.
Well, I mean, it's sort of, how could you not go, number one? I mean, frankly, just between you and me, right? I don't go to McDonald's very often when I'm in the United States. But just the sheer exotica of doing that in Moscow was an experience that I think you have to sort of put on your bucket list, number one. And then again, number two, you're absolutely right. That, look, this was a very, very difficult period for the Soviet Union sort of economically. And it was, one of the things that surprised me was that, I had enough time and the language facility to walk around in Russian shops and in Russian supermarkets. And it was not so easy. Getting the basics was was quite difficult at the time. It was a period of great economic shortage, and that was when I got to know the word deficit. But walking into McDonald's was, in its own way, sort of walking into a different world, and a world where two cultures came together in sort of predictable and unpredictable ways.
So when you arrived in 1994 for work, you weren't that surprised because you'd just been there 3 years before. Things were starting to change, but they hadn't changed that much by 1994. what were your observations of the Westerners, but in particular the Americans who were coming to Moscow to work, who perhaps didn't know the language, didn't know the culture? What was your impression of all of these Americans who came there to make money?
So there were lots of different kinds of Americans who came to Russia in the 1990s, Michael. There were people like me who came because they had studied the country, they spoke the language, and were very hungry for that immersion into a place that, they had studied, but they'd studied, remotely from quite some distance. And, without the opportunity to really dig in and live and work on the ground, because, of course, in the Soviet period, that was very difficult. So there were people that came with a sort of academic and linguistic preparation. And interacting with those people who and they did all different kinds of things. They came with the government, they came with companies, they came on cultural programs, they came as consultants, they came as lawyers, they came as doctors, you name it. And then there were people who might not have had the educational and the linguistic background, but they came for commercial purposes. Remember, Michael, that in the 1990s, the world, let alone America and Russia, but the rest of the world was undergoing its second decade of rapid globalization. And this was a time when people everywhere were going to new countries and new markets that they had never considered going to before. And Russia was one of those places. It was a new market, it was an emerging market, and it was a very attractive commercial proposition. So Americans came to sell things, to buy things, to open up companies, to establish trading relationships. And, one of the things that was so impressive about the time is that, you're right, between 1991 and 1994, not that much time had elapsed, but in a very compressed period of time, Russia was undergoing colossal transformation. And so whether you were an American that came to sell Snickers bars, or you were an American who came because Aeroflot was beginning to use Boeing aircraft, or whether you were going because you were with an opera company in New York or Los Angeles or a symphony in Chicago, and you wanted to work with the Bolshoi or with any of the other cultural institutions in America, or indeed, a lot of Americans, Michael, I suppose we should mention that a lot of Americans came to work with the Russian government on economic reform projects. And so there were lawyers and consultants and bankers and specialists in democratization and economic reform who came to Russia to work on dozens and dozens and dozens of projects on government and economic reform. And there was a large community of expats, as you mentioned, Europeans, but also Americans, who were part of, as participants and as supporters of this phenomenal transformation of the Russian economy.
I have to ask. You mentioned all of the Americans who came over to help with this transformation. A lot of them were led by our former professors at Harvard, and the assessment of their advice now and where they led Russia is a bit controversial. Do you have an opinion on how shock therapy worked and how our professors succeeded or not?
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. I mean, and there are a lot of Harvard professors in the book, and they were very generous with their time and with their commentary. I think before I say anything about this, and I will be perfectly candid with you, I think we're speaking now, Michael, with the benefit of hindsight.
Sure.
I mean, it's been more than 30 years since the institution of shock therapy. And I think that, we made mistakes. I think we made mistakes in the assumptions that we made about Russian politics and Russian business and the Russian economy. I think we made mistakes about the speed at which reforms could be implemented. I think we made mistakes about the readiness of the Russian political and economic system for change. And and so the best example of an examination of that period in retrospect, well, Michael, an interesting thing happened at the end of last year, and that was that there was a telegram between the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and the State Department in Washington that was written in 1993, I think. And that telegram was a discussion of political and economic reforms in Russia as supported by American diplomacy and American programming and American money. And that telegram initially was, as all correspondence between Moscow and Washington was, that telegram was classified. That telegram has been made public and was open for public discussion just in December of last year. And what that telegram said, Michael, was that politically, American diplomats and American reformers and the Americans who were in Moscow working on political transition, they felt that Russia was ready for political transition, and they felt that Russia was ready to do it themselves. And so American assistance was really on top of a certain amount of political momentum that already existed on the ground in Russia. This telegram, though, and it's been written about by other journalists, and it's been written about in mainstream American publications now. What the telegram said, though, that it didn't feel that the economic reform efforts were working, and that Americans were going too hard and too fast with economic transition, and that Russian economic players and the Russian economy weren't entirely ready for just how quickly the Americans wanted that economic transition to take place. And so, forgive me, that's a slightly long answer to a slightly short question. But, I think that there were some local factors in the economic advice that Americans were giving at the time that were a little bit more difficult than we may have appreciated at the moment.
So when you were in Moscow at that time, let's talk about Chuck Hecker in Moscow in the early mid-90s. You were working at the Moscow Times. How did this opportunity at Control Risks open up? Because one of the most exciting things about that time is how it was just the land of opportunity. And you went there for one thing and you left doing something completely different. So how did that evolve? And what did that lead to for you in Moscow?
You're right. And Michael, this is a fairly common story, and that is that a lot of people arrived in Moscow as one sort of with one profession or with one occupation or with one skill set, and they left many years later with a completely different profession, a completely different skill set, and a completely different experience. And so again, Michael, as I mentioned when I was talking about getting my first job with the Moscow Times, my opportunity with Control Risks, which is a geopolitical and business risk consultancy, it came completely by accident. And that is that actually I had returned to the United States initially, and I was reading a copy of the Wall Street Journal, the American newspaper, and somebody from Control Risks was quoted in an article in the Wall Street Journal. And I thought to myself, gee, that sounds like a really interesting company. Maybe I should apply for a job there. And I did. And at the exact same time that I applied for a job at Control Risks, they were looking to hire somebody into their Moscow office.
Perfect.
Well, exactly. I mean, it was a complete accident, and it was just very, very good timing. And the person who was looking to hire that, to fill that vacancy, was somebody who was living and working in Russia at the exact same time that you and I were living and working in Moscow. I had never met that person before. We traveled in different circles professionally. He was English, I was American. We had different friends. But we established after a while that we were both living and working in Moscow at the exact same time when I was at the Moscow Times. In any case, to make a long story short, he hired me to work for Control Risks. I moved to London. I started commuting to Moscow almost immediately after arriving to London. The business at the time, we're now talking about 1997, so we're moving into the late 1990s. Most of the business at the time was helping Western companies invest in Russia, getting them on the ground, or helping them establish joint ventures, or helping them establish trading relationships, and helping them understand the sort of political risk, the geopolitical risk of doing business in Russia, helping them with due diligence and business intelligence, and getting companies onto and into the Russian market. And it really accomplished one of the things that I wanted to do in leaving journalism, and that is that we were working on deals, and we were on the ground helping companies get in, watching them grow. Right after that, of course, there was the 1998 crisis. So we helped a lot of companies with crisis management exercises. But by and large, we helped an international establishment, businesses, we helped an international business presence establish itself in Russia. And it was exhilarating. It was one of the most interesting times in my professional career.
And we're going to talk about your book in a minute, but this is what your book is about: the establishment of business relationships in Russia, the arc of business in Russia from the early 90s, actually from the Tsarist era to the early 90s, late 90s, and to today. As a Russia geek, what were some of the most satisfying aspects of helping foreigners establish business in Russia? And my counterpart to this question is, how much did culture matter? Russian culture, American business culture. How much did anyone care? Or was it just cold, hard capitalism? Let's just start a business and make money and not worry about the cultural implications.
Michael, it was a little bit of everything. So to answer your second question first, I think the companies that had a richer and deeper appreciation for the place where they were doing business, and not just for the business itself, those were the companies that I believe were most successful in Russia. And I think that those are the companies, whether they're American companies or Japanese companies or Brazilian companies, these are the companies that are most successful anywhere that they do business. That we have to think about the places that we do business, not just as markets, but as countries, as political, economic, and cultural and geopolitical entities, and not just as platforms where you buy things and sell things or build things. And so the companies that took a more holistic approach towards investing in Russia, by and large, and that included, by the way, hiring Russian employees and local employees, the companies that took a more holistic approach to doing business in Russia were generally speaking, the more successful companies. Because you couldn't treat Russia just as any other market. You couldn't go there simply just to make money. It was far more complicated than that. And so not having an appreciation for that was a significant obstacle to success in Russia.
So this holistic approach, does that sorry if I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Holistic approach, that involves speaking the language, understanding Russian society, hiring Russians. Like, what makes the perfect holistic approach to being successful as a business in Russia?
Well, in the best of all circumstances, it involves a little bit of everything that you just mentioned. And that's a perfect world that doesn't necessarily exist. Having the language created enormous benefit. But, again, any non-native speakers who are on the line here will understand that that's no easy proposition. And Michael, I think you and I both consider ourselves eternal students of Russian. We both established a certain level of fluency and comfort with the language. But, once you start learning Russian, you never really stop. So, understanding the language was helpful, but not everyone had it, and that's understandable. I think understanding Russian business culture, just like understanding any country's business culture, was important. It was probably important, if it was possible, to understand a little bit of the historical context of the way the Russian economy was growing up, because the way the Russian economy was developing can trace its origins and can trace that development to aspects of the way the Soviet economy worked. And again, that's a pretty big ask. But at least having a certain level of curiosity and appreciation for the fact that you're in a certain country with certain types of norms and mores and, business practices I think was very, very important. And then just very quickly to add, Michael, I think the most rewarding part of my experience in all of that, when you work for a consulting company, you're not making a product, you're not buying and selling things, you're not making things, you're transferring knowledge. That's the primary goal of any consultant, is to make sure that your client has more knowledge after meeting you than they did before they met you. And the most rewarding part of my profession and my career in Russia was delivering that knowledge and contributing to that holistic understanding. I mean, that was my specialty. My specialty was understanding that place at that time. And so for a company that made candy bars, that's their specialty. Make candy bars. Go ahead. But I can help you understand where you're making those candy bars, who you're selling those candy bars to, and how that's all going to work. And that was enormously gratifying at the end of the day.
What were some of the experiences, the businesses that you worked with, that were where you saw Russian partners who were particularly adept at using this knowledge that you were sharing, or that were very easy to work with? And I want to contrast that with Russians who just, business people who probably butted heads with those of you sharing knowledge. I would call it telling people what to do, but for those of you sharing knowledge with them.
Right. So when two business cultures come together, when it's sort of Western business culture and an emerging Russian business environment, there are inevitable moments of friction, and there are inevitable moments of breakthrough and cooperation. I think that Americans love to talk about win-win deals and win-win situations, and that's not always the part of every business culture. Mm-hmm. And the book is called Zero Sum, and one of the reasons why it's called Zero Sum, although not the main reason, is that there was an element, not uniformly, but there was an element of Russian business culture that said, well, we don't like this win-win thing. If somebody wins, somebody has to lose. And if I come out on top, somebody else has to come out on the bottom. So getting a business culture to understand that actually two parties to a transaction can both actually profit and can both make money, and this is not a zero-sum game, that was one of the interesting things. And, to provide a little bit of detail, I mean, international business people came with commercial know-how that didn't necessarily exist in the early days of the Russian commercial environment. But what Russian JV partners and what Russian employees had was this, this phenomenal on-the-ground knowledge and comprehension of how local dynamics worked in a way that a Westerner could probably never appreciate. And, Michael, I think the interesting thing was how two sides of a business value their contribution, which is worth more, literally, in money terms and also in practical terms, which is worth more, and how do you assign a value to local know-how, and how do you assign a value to business know-how? Westerners are bringing technological and technical expertise and money, and they said, we know what this is worth because here's what it looks like in the bank. And Russians were saying, yeah, but you're not going to be able to do anything in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Novosibirsk or Vladivostok unless you talk to us first. What's that worth? And companies valued that differently. And sometimes those relations were cooperative, and sometimes those relations were antagonistic. And that's why everybody needed consultancy, by the way. But in the situations where you could make this into a cooperative venture, then great. In the situations where, or in the circumstances where the antagonism was difficult to eliminate, it was difficult. But such was the environment at the time that people still managed to make money. It was just harder and took longer.
What was going on with you professionally during these years as you opened the office for control risks in Moscow? You were working with businesses as a consultant. You were exposed, I assume, to very different industries, very different situations. Probably traveled to very different places. How were you growing as a consultant, as an expert in Russia? What new interests were you developing, and where were your sort of professional goals headed at this time?
It's really interesting. A few things. First of all, when the company began its activities in Russia, it was a very small company, and it was, the office in Moscow was a very small office, populated primarily by British people. My challenge when I became the general manager of the office in 2000, my challenge was to grow the office, which happened, and was also to find and hire and retain and educate and promote local employees, and to develop Russian employees, and to help them become successful colleagues at control risks, so they could work in Moscow, and then if they wanted to, they could work somewhere else in the company if they wanted. So that was one thing, was managing and developing the growth of the office on the ground. And, Michael, between 2000 and 2008, Russia was one of the world's fastest at growing economies. So growing the office was, in some ways, opportunities presented themselves, and almost, the phone was ringing off the hook. Managing that growth was challenging. And also the environment in our area of business services, in our area of professional services, was very competitive. And so we were managing growth, and trying to harness that growth. We were managing growth in a highly competitive environment. And then the other thing that was an ongoing challenge that I learned a lot about, Michael, was, we were risk consultants, and learning and understanding how individuals and how organizations appreciate and identify and digest and value risk was an interesting challenge to me, because, at the time, Michael, again, this is a period from 2000 to 2008 was a period of absolutely phenomenal growth in Russia, even more so than in the 1990s. And the commitment that international and American companies were making to Russia, their commitment was much more permanent and much more strategic in nature than the commitments that they were making in the 1990s. American companies in the 1990s were sort of exporting to Russia and selling things to Russia with joint ventures and Russian distributors. In the 2000s, we had American and international companies opening businesses on the ground in Russia, wholly owned Russian subsidiaries of international companies. And, one of the things that I learned about is just how different countries, different sectors, different types of companies, how they look at risk. And, we were trying to tell people, look, everything's going great in Russia. We're all growing. Everybody's making a lot of money. Please bear in mind, some of the underlying risks to doing business in this or in any jurisdiction. And, don't take your eye off the ball. Don't think that Russia is a country that, even though the economy is growing phenomenally well, don't think that this is a place without risk. And one of the challenges to me, Michael, actually was getting people to listen to me. And for American companies and other international companies to say, really, we don't want to worry about risks. Everybody's making money here. No matter what we do, we're going to sell it. Russia's growing. Everything's going great. The price of oil is high. The price of Russia, this is the resource super cycle, and Russia's subsoil metals and minerals are selling at phenomenal premiums. We don't need to think about risk. Let's just go do business. So there were challenges on that level as well.
And you, as a Russia geek, I imagine, are have this experience of Russian history and Russian dynamics and all of the possibilities of what could happen. And and it sounds like a typical situation where the Americans are barging in, full steam ahead, everything is great, money, money, money. And you're saying, but let's be realistic, it's not always perhaps going to be wonderful.
Yeah, it didn't always make me a very popular person. I mean, talking about risk doesn't always make you a very popular person in the room. And I guess, the primary challenge and what I tried to do was to say, look, have a long-term perspective on what you're doing in Russia and develop your presence in the country in a sustainable, in every respect of that word, in a sustainable fashion. And I guess what you also try to remind people, business people and Americans, and business people, Michael, have short memories, and markets also have very short memories. And what you try to do a lot of the time is remind executives not to have amnesia, not to have amnesia about what happened in the 1990s, not to have amnesia about what happened in 1998, not to have amnesia about things like the dot-com crisis, for people who remember that. And, not to have amnesia about political transition, and not to completely take leave of your senses in what was otherwise a fairly euphoric business environment. So yeah, it didn't make me the most popular person in the world. But I thought, again, that companies who had an appreciation for the good times, but an awareness of how tentative those good times can be, that those sorts of companies that had a healthy appreciation for risk were, again, the companies who did the best on the ground.
How much appreciation, if we maybe go back to the 90s, how much appreciation did American business people and their Russian colleagues, how much appreciation did they have for the societal problems, the poverty, the babushki in the metro selling, bread, just all of the suffering that was happening while some were getting really wealthy? Where I ask you this because I know you, and I know that you noticed, that you were very aware of the inequality. How much of a role did that play for American businesses, if at all?
So I think one of the assumptions that American business made, and we can talk, well, there have been books written about this. We can talk for years about this going forward, but Michael, the basic assumption that American executives had was that by doing business in Russia, you could economically and politically transform the country. And that, yes, I think everybody had an acute understanding of, the difficulty of shock therapy, the difficulty of the economic conditions of the 1990s. And even in a wealthy capital city like Moscow, the income inequality and the contrast between the way some people were living and the way other people were living was extremely stark. And, anybody who, well, let's put it this way, a lot of more junior Russian executives, business people who were living and working in Russia had Russian landlords, and they were renting apartments from Russian, people who owned their properties. And many people understood that the rent that they were paying was essentially the livelihood of the people whose apartments they were living in. Mm-hmm. So I think there was an appreciation for what was going on the ground in Russia. To Americans, this presented opportunity. It is perhaps contradictory, or presents a little bit of a paradox. But, at the very beginning of the 1990s, Russia was politically rudderless and economically, in a deep, deep, deep crisis. And Americans see this as opportunity. Let's move in. Right. Let's do business.
Let's fix it and make money.
That's right. And so the assumptions that American businesses made in Russia was that by building capitalism and by buying and selling things in Russia, we could change the country and we could change people's lives. Again, it will take quite a long historical perspective to digest all of this properly. I think to a certain degree, we did change people's lives to the extent that Russia began to integrate into the global economy, and Russian executives, Russian business people, and Russian citizens were exposed to and contributing to a global business dialogue, traveling more, getting university degrees in other countries and MBAs at Harvard and Wharton and Stanford and becoming graduate students at the Davis Center. There was a gradual integration of these opposing spheres of influence that we had. I mean, I think American business had a huge Cold War hangover. They brought a lot of mistaken assumptions about Russia when they came to Russia, and that was based on the fact that the two countries were enemies for decades. And I think that it was difficult in some cases to overcome the Cold War mentality. But I think we tried, in that economic chaos of the 1990s, it was a uniquely American approach and a uniquely American attitude to see opportunity in all of that.
And perhaps one of the successes, I'll ask you if you think this was because of Americans or not. Perhaps one of the successes was the growth of, or the emergence of, Russian know-how, Russian business acumen, Russian, responsibility for building businesses. You talk about that in your book, how over time there was, the Russians were asking, why do we need an American to come here and do this? We can do it ourselves. Was that in response to having Americans or Westerners trying to run the show and teach everything? Or did that just grow because of this openness and this partnership that evolved over the years?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I think that younger, first of all, the people, a lot of the people in Moscow and in Russia's biggest cities who went to work in international companies were the best educated students across Russia. They were people who were graduates of Russia's best educational institutions. They were people who spoke numerous foreign languages. They were people who were extremely accomplished already in mathematics, in science, in technology. They, in some cases, it was interesting. I mean, some of the anecdotes from the books were that, people who were graduates in physics from Moscow State University that spoke, English and German and French came to work as sort of, secretaries in American companies. That didn't last long, Michael. People like that, with that sort of educational background and that desire to continue to enhance their education, you don't stay a secretary very long when you're a physics graduate with, 3 or 4 foreign languages. So to a certain degree, Russians learn, and I hate to sort of paint the thing, to say Russians did this or Russians did that, but, the emerging business class in Russia learned from their Western partners, but after a while, they began to learn on their own. And, there came a point, and this is in the book, when I interviewed a number of Russian executives who said the most successful American companies in Russia, the most successful international companies in Russia were the companies that trusted their Russian managers. And you're absolutely right, Michael. At a certain point, having to call New York or having to call London or having to call Chicago or LA or Stockholm or Paris to make a business decision, that got really old and got really boring after a while. And it also was it slowed down the process of getting things done. And so being able to make executive decisions in Moscow, or in St. Petersburg, or in Vladivostok, or in Novosibirsk, or in Yekaterinburg, making decisions locally became a competitive advantage. And the international companies who did that in Russia were the ones that were most successful.
We haven't even talked about Alla Pugacheva yet. And a question just came in. What do you miss the most about your time living and working in Russia? And in fact, I was meaning to ask you more questions about, you're on the ground in Russia. What was your life like there during those years? Where did you live? What did you do? And what do you miss?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, if we go back to the 1990s, let's also remember that back then I was also a lot younger and had a lot more energy and could stay up a lot later at night. But look, this is a cliche, but it's a cliche in part because it's true. And that is, I miss the people. I am very fortunate that to this day I maintain deep, close relationships with a number of people who I met when I was living and working in Moscow. And these are people who to this very moment, Michael, remain, in extremely important individuals in my life. Number one. Number two, I love Moscow. I was crazy about Moscow. It had a 24/7 energy that was unbeatable, even when I was too old to absorb 24/7 energy. But I just, I lived, my first apartment was on Sukharevskaya Ploshchad. It was right across the street from the Sklifosovsky Institute, which is the big hospital in Moscow. So that was a great part. I was pretty much smack in the middle of Moscow. There was at one point I was living at Tverskaya Dom 6, and that was, you couldn't get closer to the center of Moscow. That was a phenomenal experience to walk out of your apartment in the mornings and be across the street essentially from the Kremlin. Was, as an American living in Moscow, it blew my mind every morning without exception. I really had to pinch myself, even when it was raining or snowing, or I was late for work, or anything. I had a bad breakfast, or the metro wasn't working. That was a mind-blowing experience. I had an apartment at one point at 1905 Street. That was further out from the very center of town, but it was a very nice apartment. Whereas the one in Tverskaya was right in the middle of town. It wasn't the greatest apartment I've ever had, but the location was unbeatable. My life, I enjoy living in big cities. I live in London now. And I enjoy living in London is a big city that keeps me busy, and there's, you're never bored. And I guess what I like, the other thing that I like the most about living in Moscow, and I think this is important, and I think you'll recognize this, and hopefully lots of other people will recognize this, is that, if you left Moscow for any period of time and then came back, it was different. If you went away for a week, if you went away for 2 weeks, if you went away for 6 weeks, and you came back to Moscow, back to the same apartment, the city looked entirely different. There was always something new. There was a new building. There was a new restaurant. There was a new company. There was a new, or something got torn down. The city changed overnight sometimes. And that sort of dynamism I miss very much about Moscow. I miss, it's the biggest city in Europe, and for a very long time was the fastest city in Europe. And I think that's what I miss.
I miss that. I miss that pace. I miss that dynamism. It's a wonderful city. Do you ever, and I know the answer to this because we all do you look back on the Moscow of the 90s with nostalgia and think about how much it's changed and perhaps how much it has lost from those post Gorbachev years with the excitement and the hope? And has it lost some of its unique flavor?
There is a time, Russia in the 1990s and Moscow in the 1990s is a time and a place that will never happen again. And it will never happen anywhere again. It was, look, in the transition from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation, so much changed and so much stayed the same. And it was being in the middle of that sort of, dynamism, but in context dynamism. I will always miss that. And, look, nostalgia is a tricky concept. One always tends to look at past events perhaps in the most favorable light. I miss the fact that I was young. I miss the fact that I could stay out until 2:00 in the morning. I miss the fact that, just so many different things about being in a society that at one point, that simultaneously was one of the world's most established societies, culturally and historically and politically, economically, but at the exact same time was a society that was literally inventing itself or reinventing itself every single day. That was the 1990s. And then, just the craziness of it all. That will never happen again anywhere. And, maybe that's a good thing. But look, if you contrast that to the Moscow of the 2000s, all cities develop a rhythm and a pattern and a certain stability. And that's probably a good thing, because you really can't. One of the things that we haven't really mentioned is that this dynamism was entirely chaotic, and you can't live in a permanent state of chaos. As much fun or as exciting as that would be, you can't live in a state of chaos forever. And so the fact that there may be less chaos as Russia and as Moscow developed, that's probably a good thing.
That's definitely a good thing. As you were talking to people for your book, interviewing others who had done business in Russia, what were some of the lessons they had gleaned? What were some of the experiences that they think that the marks that they left on Russian society that they're most proud of?
A few things. I mean, I think I am happiest, and forgive me for being a bit sort of preachy here. I am happiest when people who lived and worked in Russia left the country with a greater appreciation for the place that they were, the place that they lived and worked in as they left. I'd like to think that that's a two-way process, and that Americans who visit Russia leave something of themselves there when they go. And maybe something about American values, and maybe something about American, forgive me for overusing this word perhaps, but dynamism. Maybe something about the win-win spirit. And I think, Americans and Russians actually, interestingly, I think more often than not got along well than not. And I think that there's a certain, Americans tend to be we're a fairly emotional people, Michael. We speak openly about emotions. We're fairly open. I've now lived in London long enough to understand that the British are a little bit different in that respect. But Russians, I think also are, with, again, making enormous generalizations, but I think I feel comfortable in doing this, and that is that I think Russians are reasonably emotional people, tend to wear their heart on their sleeves, that when you become friends, we speak openly with each other. And I think some of that, that Americans who came to Russia left that impression as well when they went home. And, whether it's through American soft power or just the fact that the borders were open and people were, the borders were porous and people were going back and forth as often as they wanted, and bringing with them what they wanted and taking with them what they could. I thought that was enormously important, Michael.
This book, so you finished this book. Are you still working at Control Risks?
No, I'm done. I'm working on a proposal for a second book now.
Good. That was my question, and you just answered it. So, all right. Should I ask what it's about?
It's a huge secret at this point, Michael. Actually, okay. It's not about Russia. It's about Eastern Europe.
Well, let me ask you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, there's a question here about how often do you use your Russian? So what I was leading to was, how are you still engaged with Russian culture? Do you speak Russian with your friends? Are you still using the language? Are you reading? How do you engage with Russian?
With the language, I speak Russian every day. And I also write a lot of Russian because Lord knows I'm doing an awful lot of text messaging and sending SMSs and WhatsApps in Russian every day. And thankfully, WhatsApp has, autocorrect. So some of my mistakes are covered over. But because, just because of the number of people who I'm in close contact with, either locally or over distances, I'm speaking Russian every day. I speak it in London all the time. I speak it when I travel. I speak it on the phone. I did, on Skype and on WhatsApp and on everything you can imagine with Russians all over the world. And I'm very lucky that way because you know how it is with languages. You really have to use them frequently. Otherwise, they tend to you lose your mastery and you lose your fluency and your vocabulary. I speak Russian every day, and I feel quite lucky to do that.
That's wonderful. Are you reading anything? Do you read any Russian authors in Russian?
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of Russian media.
Yeah.
I listen to a lot of Russian music. I watch Russian films. I read a lot of Russian for the book. Mostly I'm just sort of, picking up just, websites and news and analysis and more than anything else. What else? What was the last thing that I did? I think I went to, I'm trying to think the last sort of cultural performance that I went to that was in Russian. But I have the opportunity because Russian culture is also very, very well represented in London, that I'm able to go to lots of Russian cultural events in Russian all the time.
When you go back to Russia, I know you love Moscow. Where else will you go? What other towns?
So, when the moment arrives, what I desperately want to do is go to the Russian Far East. I had the great opportunity when I was still at the Moscow Times. I actually was able to travel to Sakhalin Island and to the town of Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk.
Mhm.
And Michael, there's nothing more mind-blowing than getting on a plane and flying for 9 hours, and you get off that plane and you're in the same country. And that is genuinely, I don't believe that that's an experience that you can repeat anywhere else in the world. And I have never been to Vladivostok. I would like very much to go to the Russian Far East. I would like very much to go to Lake Baikal, and I know that that's sort of a typical kind of bucket list sort of thing. I think I would like to do a little bit more nature. I tend to be a city person. I think I need to force myself to do a little bit more nature travel in Russia. And I would look forward very much to doing that.
Great. Well, we'll ask people to continue this conversation on YouTube, and maybe you can get some recommendations for where to go next. Chuck, thank you. When we can go. Chuck, thank you very much for this conversation. This was a lot of fun. I love your book. I have to say, it's not just interesting, but it's so well written and it's fun to read. If a business book can be fun to read, then you've done something right.
Michael, I can't thank you enough for the invitation. It's great to see you again. It's great to catch up and talk. Russia Geek to Russia Geek. Thank you to the American Center. Thank you to everybody who's dialed in. I hope this has been enjoyable, and I look forward to keeping in touch in any way that I can.
Great. Great to see you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Michael.
Goodbye.